Hello, tiny people. I'm sorry to get this to you so late. We're having a little bit of difficulty there with the technology here today. But here's the slides and some of the ideas that I put together for those of you who missed class. All right. George Washington is known as the father of our country because he did a number of amazing things at the start of the nation. And what he wanted to be was a planter. This is his home, Mount Vernon in Virginia. And what George Washington wanted to do was to go home and enjoy the life of a country squire. He was a wealthy fellow and he owned lots of property and he wanted to enjoy the fruits of his labor. But he continued to to answer the call of his nation. First, they called him up and said, General or Washington, we really need you to be the general of the Continental Army. It's important we have a Southerner to take command to get the other colonies involved, and you've got the experience. Would you lead the army? And he agreed. He actually agreed to do it without taking any pay during the entire length of the American Revolution. He was victorious. The Americans won. And then he went back home to be a planter. But they called him again. I called him up later and said, General, what we need now is these Articles of Confederation aren't working very well, and we would really need the character that you've represented. Remember, he was that model of civic virtue for having turned down the crown at the end of the Revolution. We need that in order to sell the people on this new Constitution. We have to replace the Articles of Confederation, and we need you to be in charge of the Constitutional Convention. So he came as a delegate and was elected president of the Constitutional Convention. And now he's answering the call of his country another time because he had gone home once more to be a planter. And now he comes back to be the first president of the United States. Now, think about this man. To take over and run a country would be such a phenomenally difficult job anyway. But he had nobody to show him how. There was no on-the-job training. That's what OJT is. Imagine that. You're going to work making French fries at McDonald's, and somebody's going to teach you how to take the fries out of the freezer and put them into the basket and what temperature to set the fryer at, and they're going to tell you how to put the basket down into the oil, where to press the button so the timer works, and then it'll tell you to pick it up and shake the fries out, and then you put them back down and press the timer again, and then a little bit later it'll tell you to pick them up and shake the fries out again and put them into the holding basket here, and then how to scoop them up and put them in the boxes or the bags and make the French fries at McDonald's. That's such a simple job, yet somebody would be there to teach you step by step how to do it. And here there is this incredibly complicated job of running a nation, and George Washington had no one to look at because there was nobody who had ever done it before. The United States was a new country. So he gathered together the people that he thought would help him run a nation. First thing he did was he made a cabinet. And a cabinet in this case isn't someplace where you keep your dish towels or your good silverware. The cabinet here is a group of close presidential advisors, each of whom runs a part of the government. A group of close presidential advisors, each of whom runs a part of the government. And George Washington simply said, well, what do governments do? Well, they deal with other governments. And remember, we have this little weird definition of state, like everybody else would call this a province. But no, to everybody else on earth, it seems that the word state means country. They could talk about the state of Japan, the state of Israel, the state of Great Britain. So what would he need? Somebody to deal with the other states. He would need a secretary of state, an assistant to help in dealing with other countries. He picked Thomas Jefferson, someone to help him choose ambassadors, representatives of our country that go live in the other country. He would answer the correspondence from foreign governments and take care of what business he could, noting what would actually need the president's attention. Then governments deal with money. They'd no longer be using British currency, so they'd have to start with designing their own money, printing their own money, making their own coins, setting the value thereof. And somebody would have to take charge of that, collecting the taxes and paying people. And he chose Alexander Hamilton. as the first Secretary of the Treasury. And thank goodness he did, because Alexander Hamilton was insistent that we use a base 10 number system for our money. Britain had this horrible currency system with farthings and pence and pounds and shillings, and 16 of these equals one of those equals 2 3/4 of that. It was a terrible system. And Hamilton said, no, let's make this really easy. 10 pennies equal a dime, 10 dimes equal a dollar. And for ease of purchasing, we'll have a half a dollar, a quarter dollar, and a half a dime. And then we've pretty much covered everything. So Alexander Hamilton gave us a fairly simple currency system. Then, of course, countries would eventually have to use military force. So we needed a Secretary of War. That position is no longer called the Secretary of War. It's now called the Secretary of Defense. But he chose as his Secretary of War a man named Henry Knox. He'd been a bookseller in Boston during the American Revolution, and he had ingratiated himself in with the British officers around Boston when Boston was an occupied city. And he'd found out so much about artillery and military science. He worked sort of as a spy for George Washington, but also gathered to himself such an incredible amount of knowledge that he wound up in charge of Washington's artillery. He's incidentally the guy who went and did the engineering to bring the cannons down from Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point to Boston. There needed to be someone to enforce the federal laws inside the country. That would be a position called Attorney General, and he chose Edmund Randolph from South Carolina. Now, if there was a problem with laws being enforced, say, on the high seas, that would fall to the Department of War. If it was a problem between countries, that would fall to the Department of State. But this would be enforcing laws within the United States. And finally, he chose as his last member of the cabinet, and some presidents have used vice presidents as advisors. Some have pretty much ignored them. But Washington knew that setting this new government up was going to be terribly difficult and that John Adams was a brilliant man. So he included him in the first cabinet, John Adams, the vice president. So that is the cabinet setup, the way Washington originally divided the government and made it functional. But Washington was a man whose character, whose civic virtue said that each individual should always do what's best for the country, not just what's best for himself. But political parties formed. And political parties are groups of people who band together to pass laws and move the country in the direction they want. Washington originally didn't like the idea of political parties, but he eventually became a Federalist. Now, there were two political parties to begin with. The first was the Democratic Republicans. You may not call this the Democrats. You may not call this the Republicans. This is a separate entity. The party was called the Democratic Republicans. It was started by Thomas Jefferson, and his view of what America should become was a set of small farming communities with people being almost independent. Sure, there'd always be a few things you'd have to have made other places and brought in, but for the most part, people should be able to make whatever it is that they would need. So Thomas Jefferson believed that the ordinary person was perfectly capable of contributing and being a part of government. He was very democratic that way. And he was the founder of the Democratic Republican Party. Small communities, a weak central government. He hadn't been at the Constitutional Convention. He didn't like the idea. He thought it gave too much power to the central government. The other political party were the Federalists. That was begun by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. They had a very different view of America's future. They thought that we should tie ourselves to Europe. We should try to become exactly what the European powers were. That is, we should have big cities. We should worry much more about manufacturing than we ever would about just farming on a small scale. And most importantly, they wanted to have a powerful central government. They thought that if we were to have our president deal with the kings of Europe, then he would need to have nearly the power of a European king. So those were the two views, the two political parties that started off. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that's been a help, and we hope we see you tomorrow. Hasta la vista, babies.